Welcome to this presentation of the Rotary Club of North Bethesda, Maryland, USA. Our club was established in 1974. We meet every Friday morning at 7:45 a.m., and we often invite guest speakers to give presentations on all kinds of interesting subjects. Please contact us through our website at nbrotary.org. And thanks for watching. Our speaker today is Dr. Bruce Fowler, a toxicology consultant and fellow of the Academy of Toxicological Sciences. He is also a member of our North Bethesda Rotary Club. He will share with us some of his vast knowledge about lead in drinking water.
Talk about lead in drinking water. Bob had a long title that he wanted me to talk about, but I'm going to basically sort of jump back and forth between a couple thousand years of history of lead and water and some of the effects that are known to occur with this stuff. Okay, now how do I advance this, Camilla? Okay, here we go. Okay, so the issue of lead in drinking water, the two theses I'm going to talk about here are that one, this is not new stuff. This is, the Romans started using lead pipes actually it turns out about 120 BC. And I'm going to show you some pictures of some of their handiwork, which are still in place today. The Roman engineer who was sort of the big kahuna of this is a guy named Vitruvius. And he put in a lot of the major water systems. And he actually favored use of clay pipes over lead because lead was dangerous. They knew it at that time, back 20 BC. And he wrote something to the effect that, well, we know lead is bad stuff, but on the other hand, it's cheap and easy to work with. So we use it anyway. Next slide. Okay, all right. Now, this is pretty cool stuff, actually. The Romans, the way you make a lead pipe is that, or they'd made lead pipes, is that they would, because lead is a soft metal, they could roll it into flat sheets and then roll it up like a newspaper, okay? And they formed what were called fistulas. And this is a piece of a fistula here. They were so proud of these things that the maker would put his or her name on it, the name of the person for whose house. These were service lines carrying water from the main lines and the aqueduct into the private residences. And so they would stamp their names on it and when they did it. Now, the archaeologists just love these things because it nails exactly when something was done and to whom it was given or for whom it was done. Okay, so here's the name of one of the people. Let's see. Can we have the next slide? Okay. Also, these Roman engineers were pretty clever. This is a communal unisex latrine in Rome, and with lead pipes, and the water from the river Tiber is running under this, so people could come and use the latrine, and the waste was carried away by the river Tiber down to the harbor. And it's, you can just see people hanging out here, chatting away and feeling better about themselves. Okay, but these things are still in place a couple thousand years later. That's the important point.
So Bruce, this is not only in Italy, but also throughout that part of the world, because I saw similar things in Turkey when I visited Turkey.
Anywhere the Romans went, I'm going to show you a picture of one of the lead lines in Bath, England. The Roman Empire was quite large at that time, and they brought their plumbing with them. Okay, next slide. Okay, here's one of the pipes. This is a soldered lead pipe in place this is in Bath, England. And basically, as I said, they rolled these things up and then they would solder the pieces together and put it into the ground or into the stonework. Now, the Romans got really good at this, and these pipes, the fistulas, could be from the size of about half an inch up to 20 inches. So in other words, they got pretty facile at forming these things. Next slide. Okay, now I'm going to fast forward ahead here to 2014, 2015. Now remember what I said about lead being cheap and easy to work with. In 2014, thereabouts, the city of Flint, Michigan, as a cost-saving measure, decided to switch from water that they were getting from the Detroit water system to their own water taken from the Flint River. Now, this is where we get into some water chemistry. You can see that these two things are very different. It turns out that whether lead stays in the pipes or it comes out of the pipes depends on the water and pH of the water and how hard or soft the water is. That means, does it have things like calcium phosphate, calcium carbonate in it that coat the inside of the pipe so the water doesn't leach out, or so the lead doesn't leach out. Okay, so Detroit, Flint, switched over as a cost-saving measure to say, heck, we got a river here, we can do this. We have a water treatment plant that is set up to handle bacterial infections, but it wasn't set up to handle chemicals. So you can see what happened, and pretty quickly after they did this, there were complaints that the water tasted bad, indeed. So, next slide. And these are the pipes from Flint, Michigan. And so what happened was that because they weren't adding something to the water to prevent orthophosphate, is what they added, to prevent the corrosion of the pipes corroded, and the lead that was in there came out as well. Now, this is, as we say, a big fat hairy mess right now. It still is. There are a number of lawsuits and other legal things that are ongoing to this day, as far as I understand it. Because, and let's look at it from the point of view of the city fathers in Flint, Michigan. Actually, this happened in Washington, D.C. around 2003, 2004. Yonkers, New York, if you're familiar with that place. Many American cities have service lines like these. These are lines like the Romans that bring water from the main water lines, trunk lines, into homes. So, and there are, if you look at it, thousands and thousands of miles of these things. So how do you solve the lead problem? Well, the straightforward answer is you go and tear up every water line in the entire city. Now, this is prohibitively expensive and a big mess. And we're talking billions of dollars here. So it's better to pay the lawyers billions of dollars to fight it out than do anything about it. Now, in the case of Flint, Michigan, they did what many other places have done when they have a bad problem. They tried to stick their head in the sand and pretend it wasn't there. So, but it didn't work because someone in the town of, or city of Flint had contracted with a professor at Virginia Tech University in Blacksburg, Virginia, who was doing in metal analyses. And he said, the water here is so far above the EPA drinking water standard, we're not gonna, you gotta do something about it. Next slide. Okay, now these are just some statistics. These are actually a little out of date in terms of the NHANES. All of us are exposed to lead in various forms. In Baltimore, for example, we have a big problem continuing with lead in paint. And that's a whole nother story, but let's stick with water. But the idea is that right now, and actually I think we're trying to knock this level of concern down to 5 micrograms per deciliter. This is a very small number, I'll just put it that way. But nonetheless, this line below the bottom, NHANES 3 average blood lead value, this is maybe 5 or 10 years ago.
Just a clarification, NHANES is the National Nutrition and Examination Health and Examination Survey, which is actually here in Harrisville, Maryland, which is a pretty big facility, which they monitor both the food as well as the intake of all chemicals and agents and so on.
Thank you, Bob.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, now, the important thing is this last line here. There's recognition, and this is from a report of a committee of the National Academy of Sciences that I chaired back about 1990, to look at lead exposure in children. And at that time, this committee went through everything that was known then, and we came away with the conclusion that for some people, some individuals, there is no threshold for lead. In other words, even with these numbers that have been dropped down, they've been dropping, sharply over the last 20, 30 years because people were finding these effects. For some people, it's sort of like alcohol. It's like that there are some people who are very, very sensitive to alcohol and have no tolerance for it. Others who can, sit in the bar all day and imbibe, and they'll be looking pretty normal. But lead isn't a nasty, sneaky one. Okay, you don't have a choice of whether you're exposed because we're all exposed. And whether or not you become a person of concern depends on a number of factors, which I'm going to get into in a minute. Okay, could I have the next slide? Okay, so these are these 2 cities that I mentioned: Flint, Michigan, which is the highlighted case in point, but also Washington, D.C. Actually, it's any older city where they use lead solder or lead in the lines. Now, the problem are these what are called service lines, has been water brought in from the main line in the street into the houses. Now, if you look, and after we get finished here, if you go home and you look under the sink in your house, if you have a house built, let's say in the 80s or maybe even 90s, and that has copper plumbing in it, copper pipes, look at the joints where the pipes are joined. In older times, but not recently because it's been banned, lead and copper rule, that's what it's called, EPA. They banned these joints because the lead was leaching out of the joints into the water. Okay, so it's even closer to home than that. Next slide. Risk assessment. Now, there's some things in water that are a risk and that you can see them. I don't have to tell you that actually this isn't a particularly dangerous shark, but it is a shark and they're not trustworthy really. The idea is that you can see this and you can appreciate that this is a concern. The problem with lead in water or any other matrix is you can't see it. And if it's down low enough, you can't taste it. So you can be exposed and you can be put yourself at risk and not know it. Next slide. So now we're getting into the lead poisoning. Now, the concern has been historically about lead exposure in children. Actually, lead is for everybody. It's a complex disorder. This is a democratic chemical that affects all the major organ systems, and including things like hypertension. And these cognitive and behavioral effects, like I said, have been known for a long time, but that's sort of really just the tip of the iceberg. It's something that someone could measure, they could see it. Your kid didn't get into Harvard because they were exposed to lead when they were small, that kind of thing. But nonetheless, this lead is sneaky, I'll say it like that. It affects the kidneys, the nervous system, blood pressure, a lot of things. Next slide. Okay, now, if we look deeper into things, I love these things, you then ask yourself the question, why should that be? Next slide. Well, it's what I said earlier, that within the general population, there are people who are very, very sensitive subpopulations, and the general population may be able to tolerate exposure and function without incident for a long time. Some of the factors are under that sensitive population balloon: age, gender, nutritional status, genetic susceptibility, and exposure to other chemicals. Bear in mind that there are 90,000 chemicals in commercial use in the United States, and about 1,000 new ones every year. So we're exposed to all kinds of things, including nano things, but that's another story too. Next slide. Okay, I just reiterated this. I want to call attention to the aged because there are a number of us on this call who fall into this category technically, although I think we all know that we're really just young people at heart. But nonetheless, the fact is that older people are also susceptible to this stuff. Genetic susceptibility, which is where I'm going to go with this, has been an interest of mine for a number of years, actually, I don't say decades, but a number of years. And what does that mean? Next slide. Don't let this slide scare you. This is the heme biosynthetic pathway. And this is the pathway by which we produce heme for things like hemoglobin, that red pigment in your blood, and a number of other activities for drug metabolizing enzymes and whatever. Anyway, these little cross hatches across these lines are places where we have documented that lead, as well as arsenic and other things, inhibit the pathway. Now, of the steps in this pathway, if you look to the left, over and down under that arrow that says ALA, that's aminolevulinic acid, and there's an enzyme, ALA-D, that's blocked by lead, gallium, and indium. That enzyme is the second step in the heme biosynthetic pathway. Next slide. Okay, so this enzyme has been shown to be, of the things that you can measure in the body, one of the most sensitive to inhibition by lead of anything. And where it gets interesting is that this enzyme, which is a protein, is coded by a single gene localized on chromosome 9q34. And it exists as two forms, LAD1 and LAD2. These biochemists are not really imaginative, but it's pretty catchy. But the idea is that there are two forms of this enzymes. The difference between these two genes, or alleles, is one mutation. There is, for those of you who've had your molecular genetics, there's a guanosine and a cytosine switch at position 177. And it changes the ALAD. And so the ALAD2 becomes the more susceptible. It binds the lead tighter. So depending on how carefully you chose your parents, if you are a carrier of ALAD2 or a carrier of ALAD1-2, a hybrid, you would be more susceptible to the effects of lead because it binds it tighter. Next slide. Okay, so I'm going to wrap this up. A piece of history again. The symbol for lead is Pb, which is from the Latin plumbium. And it's a soft malleable metal, easy to form into pipes by rolling them up into tubes, as I said. Fistulas is the Latin word for these things. And they're used in service lines to connect the main water lines to individual homes. And the public health problems associated with lead in drinking water have been known for a couple thousand years. And in lead pipes in Rome, if you ever wondered where the word plumber came from, it was that. These were the folks who made the pipes, plumbium. Now, to go back to where the previous speaker was talking, it turns out that the plumbers were probably more supervisors than anything else. They had slaves. The slave business goes back a very long way. But still, the idea was because they could work with the lead, they could mold it, they could change it, you do a lot of things with it, and it was cheap. They would get it when they mined these other metals. It came with them. Low cost, ease of use. Next slide. And so today, we have lead solder used to seal copper and actually iron pipes too. This lead and copper rule that I mentioned, it was aimed at trying to cut this out. However, lead can be released from the thousands of miles of lead lines that exist in this country and other countries, as a matter of fact, by acidic water or by soft water. That's a water that doesn't have salts in it, like phosphate. And there have been major problems, a hue and cry, related to the leaching of lead from these service lines into drinking water. And in the case of Flint, Michigan, the problems arose because of a cost-saving measure. They were trying to save money. They didn't want to pay a service fee to the city of Detroit. So, but their water system wasn't set up to handle the chemicals. It was set up to deal with things like Legionella and bacteria, things like that. Now, so this litigation has gone on. In fact, they sent one of the, I don't know what she was, one of the supervisors of this water system to prison for lying about the fact who knew what when. And so this is like I say, this gets to be a sticky wicket, and it has long-term consequences. Nonetheless, we have learned from this. Whether or not we can do anything about it because of the cost is really gets down to some fiscal issues. Because imagine that you're the mayor or supervisor of a city that has 10,000 miles of lead line pipes in your town, and people are concerned about the stuff in their water. What do you do about it? Well, to tear up all the water lines is very expensive. So what has been happening is that people have been using orthophosphate, is the chemical, to coat the inside of the lines to try to mitigate the release of lead from the pipes. Okay, that's all I've got for you guys. I'll stop there.
Bruce, this is Joe. Thank you. Thank you. Can you comment on what might be happening with the water supply right here in Montgomery County?
Well, no, I can't actually.
Well, I can. Bruce, about a year back, I looked into the lead problem in the Montgomery County, and we have none. Actually, we are in compliance with the EPA's regulations for the lead in drinking water. So Montgomery County is in pretty good shape. I know it because I looked at the data.
Bruce, so how do you identify the lead solder in the pipes?
Well, okay, this is where you'd have to have some, okay. If you look at the joints, say under your sink, if you have lead copper pipes, this will be a shiny, okay, a shiny silver material. Now, about 20 years ago, I believe, because of this problem of the lead solder, plumbers started switching over to another type of metal to seal the joints. So it depends on how old your line is, really what it comes down to. If this was done back in the 70s and 80s, it was undoubtedly lead. But because of this problem of lead leaching from the solder, they switched over to other metals, which are more expensive. That's the driver. But you know, it's with us, and because this was used for so long and so widely used, it's a general problem. Now, as Bob pointed out, we're fortunate here in many ways in Montgomery County in having relatively new housing stocks and other things like that with new water systems. In other words, the lessons learned from these older places have been reduced. And like I said, the use of orthophosphate as a sealant to coat the inside of the water lines has gone a long way to preventing the release of lead.
I can also tell you that the nephrologist, I see the water, and we analyze the water all the time at the dialysis unit that come into the units. And I've been seeing it since the early 90s, at least. I've been seeing, the water analysis. There hasn't been any excessive lead in the water lines in Montgomery County. So I can tell you, measuring it, it's been clean.
Okay. No, like I said, because of these historical problems, people have moved to address them. There's nothing good you can say about lead other than it's cheap and easy to work with. But from a public health perspective, it isn't, it's, as Vitruvius noted, it's bad stuff. Stop there.
So I think one of the things which I would like to make comment about, the lead still exists in several inner cities, basically like Philadelphia, New York, Detroit, you name it, Baltimore, and so on, because the lead in the pen chips, which the little kids in the inner cities are actually consuming it. So lead is a problem, also still remains a problem. For 1 million kids in this country, mostly happens to be the minority population. The inner cities are exposed to lead. The second is also lead is also found in every dump sites, if you can think of, what we call Superfund sites around the country. And lead is there in every Superfund site, along with several other metals and other chemicals. But lead is a serious problem. It costs millions and millions of dollars even to dealing with these problems. Not in some cases, like Department of Defense has to clean up the sites, and the cost is huge.
Then
Bruce, this is Barry. Do we not also have a problem with lead solder in much of the electronics industry, where they have gone through this business of breaking down, trying to save the special metals at that point, but the solder contaminant, particularly on the beaches in Bangladesh, where some of these ships are being broken up and so that's happening?
Yeah, this is a global problem. If you stand back and look at it, it is enormous. But again, one of the drivers has been it's cheap and easy to work with.
Right.
That's why they did it. Now, let me amend something that Bob said about the lead in paint. how many of you have ever rubbed your hand against a white painted flagpole or a building and you get a fine chalky dust off on your hands? That is lead carbonate probably. And this lead paint was used up until maybe in the
80s.
1975 or so.
yeah. Now let me just say this: that lead paint the dust is actually one of the most effective ways to get lead into somebody because it's fine particulates. You don't have to suck on a lead paint chip to get it. If you live in a house full of this stuff, you're breathing it, and kids crawling around on the floor get it on their hands and lick their fingers, that kind of thing. That's how most of us would get it, probably. Now, it's getting the lead out of the paint and I'll just say this real quick so you know why they did it. They did it for aesthetics because of that dust flaking, fine dust coming off of the painted surfaces in a climate like ours, humid, which has algae and other things that grow on the walls outside. Because it kept shedding, it would always present a clean white surface. They didn't have to paint it so often. So, in other words, this is you'll never look at a flagpole again quite the same way if you get into this. Okay. Last
The
thing.
biggest achievement of the EPA is about taking the lead out of gasoline about 1979 or so. Here, the science really dictated the action, and politicians listened to that. Unleaded gasoline, I think you will now leaded gasoline, you'll never find it because of the knocking agent, the lead was used as an anti-knocking agent in the cars. So I think we have to keep in mind the lead is the most dangerous around the world. Less so in this country, it still remains here as a problem, but in the developing world, lead is a very serious problem. I can tell you that, which I was involved in getting the lead out of gasoline in India, which is a kind of a nightmare for political reasons,
Yeah.
So Bruce, a question. So it seems that a lot of people have switched to use of bottled water because of the decreased trust in institutions. And that, of course, creates its own set of environmental problems and costs. Increased costs paid by the user, storing and shipping, and less revenue for the water treatment utility.
Right.
And possible less monitoring of water quality from the bottled water. So these are also cost issues. And I wonder if anybody has calculated what the comparative cost is for all the use of bottled water.
Well, that's a good point. That's an excellent point because, and to use the old expression, there ain't no such thing as a free lunch. That no matter what, water is essential for life. We have to have it. We have to remain hydrated. And if the water coming from the municipal water systems is regarded as unsafe, people, and this is what they did in Flint, Michigan. I think they're still on bottled water up there. Or they'd gone back to Detroit, actually. But anyway, they were bringing in all of this bottled water, okay? But then what do you do with the plastic bottles?
Yeah.
Okay, in other words, and this is when you were talking about the ships being broken up in developing countries. And it's the same thing. In other words, we create waste, but then what do you do with it? In other words, you try to solve one problem, but you create another one, which may be, just as bad, if not worse.
And we don't know the source of much of our bottled water.
Yeah, there's another old expression too. You can pay now or pay later.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. Well, what
Yes,
you do the best.
Michael.
I couldn't hear you. Who was that?
It was Carmela.
Oh, Carmela. Are we done? We're at 8:30. Yeah. Okay. Well, we can continue this.
Well, no, Victoria wanted to ask a question.
Oh, okay.
You need to unmute
Victoria?
yourself, Victoria. Unmute
Sure.
yourself.
You're muted, Victoria. Put your mic on.
She keeps going in and out. I think she's having internet issues.
Yeah,
So
I
I
had,
have one question that's pretty generic to all of us. Instead of buying plastic bottles full of water, many of us use filters, good ones that you can buy in a store. But how good are they? Do they really take out something like lead and all this other chemicals? We have no idea what's in our water.
okay, the other, and a lot of these filters, they're designed, there are a whole bunch of other chemicals in the water. Halomethanes, these are chlorinated chemicals, and many of those filters are set up to pull those out. But then the question,
there are 3,500 some odd number of chemicals in the water
yeah, okay,
that is being monitored all the time.
yeah, okay.
So I do want to, let me just interrupt real fast. People are welcome to stay on. We are at the bottom of the hour. I know that there are folks that need to head out, but we're happy to, keep the line open for people to ask questions. For those that need to leave, have a great week. Those that want to stay on and continue to ask questions, I think, Bruce, you can take a few more.
Sure.
Okay.
Carmela, are you still there?
I am.
Okay, how about Victoria?
Can you hear me now?
I can
Yes.
hear you now.
Yeah, I'm not at home. I have just one bar. So my question is, it's a lot of plumbeous, what is, everywhere. What you recommend to do with this one? Put it underground, but it's a water system underground too, some groundwater, or what to do with all this lead in the world? Do you know some usage for that, or what to do?
Well, the one really effective use has been lead shielding for radiation, because it's a dense material. But that's the problem. I mean, we have, as Bob pointed out, we have mined millions of tons of this stuff out of the earth. And if it had stayed in the earth, it wouldn't be such a mess. It would be basically a bunch of rocks. But we didn't. We mobilized it, and then because it was easy to use and it was effective. But so they did it, even though they knew, going back to Vitruvius, that this was dangerous material. But they did it anyway. And so, I mean, and it's the point that Dan made. You can pay us now or you can pay us later, but there ain't no free lunch. So, and there's no good answer to your question, Victoria. Even if you buried it, sooner or later, somebody would dig it up and put a day school on top of it. I mean, that's what they did with dioxins in Italy. They dug up one of their sites and covered it over with a liner and then built a daycare center on it. We can't help ourselves. But the fact is, looking at this, if you stand back and look at it, there are more and more of us every day. Last time I looked, it was something like 360 million people, or more than that.
One of the major effects, I think, Bruce, that we have not touched upon on kids, young kids are the very young kids, the IQ drop. As the increase in lead in blood happens in these kids, mostly inner city, the intelligent quotient or the IQ drops. I don't remember the numbers, but there's a drop in IQ levels in the kids if you are heavily exposed to lead as a pregnant mother or even as a child.
Yeah, actually, Herb Needleman used to talk about this.
Yeah.
It's basically, as he pointed out, it's about a 5-point drop in IQ. Yeah. And he said at Harvard, people will kill for 5 IQ points. Okay, it makes a difference. That doesn't, I mean, it's the societal implications of this are, they try to quantify them.
The other major effect of lead, which Dr. Herb Nidelman, who passed away recently, but who has done a lot of research in this area, also the violence associated with the lead. So he did studies in prisoners and found the lead levels were higher, and they related to the violence in the prisoners. So I think there are tons of information about the effects of lead besides the neurodevelopmental effects and so on. There's other effects in in the adult population.
Yeah.
I got a
No.
quick question maybe for Krista. Krista, hi. Do you run into lead as a subject in your studies?
So actually in one of my classes right now, me and a small group of people are analyzing, actually I have the paper right here, hold on. You know how you say you have paper somewhere? Oh, it's right here, it's under all my other papers.
You're too young for this.
No, it's okay.
Not really.
I like to print things out. So actually one of my classes right now, we are discussing, I'm just gonna review the title, a sensitive XRF screening method for lead in drinking water. So this is just how they find lead in drinking water. It's been a recent topic for a lot of our classes. As I mentioned before, Todd and I are in a lab right now, and we're looking into lead in our water sources that we've brought from our respective homes. And Flint has been a constant topic of discussion as well when it comes to policy. So it's something that has come up frequently through our time in the EMAT program.
Okay. Can I say something about the XRF? 95% of the lead in our bodies is in our skeletons, and the XRF, bone X-ray fluorescence, can be used to measure that. And there are a few of these machines. What happens is that, and this relates to pregnant women and the unborn children, the unborn child gets first draw on mother's mineral stores from the skeleton. That also includes lead. And in colonial times, women liked to get pregnant because they felt better. Okay, basically what they were doing was transferring some of their lead burden to the baby, the unborn infant. Other thing to mention to you is that I had one of these machines in Baltimore, and I asked the physicist who was running the machine, I said, well, now the X-ray lines for mercury are right next to the ones for lead. Could you check and see if there's mercury? And it turns out there was, that this particular physicist was from England, so she had lots of mercury fillings, and she plotted everybody in the laboratory. And basically there's a straight line between the number of mercury amalgam fillings at that time and the X-ray, the mercury in the bone. Now, in my case, in addition to mercury, I had a couple of gold crowns. They found gold in my shin bone, which is where we were measuring it. The point being that the skeleton is a dynamic system, and elements are going in and out of it all the time. And so as you age and you demineralize your skeleton, you can be releasing your historical stores of things like lead and mercury and other things.
So just a comment, Bruce. Bruce and I did with the studies on the lead mobilization from the skeleton from the pregnant monkeys, rhesus monkeys, at the University of Wisconsin, Madison. We did several studies on this, how the lead is mobilized from the skeleton of mothers and into the next generation, actually, in little monkeys. So I think this is a very fascinating subject. And I think, as Bruce mentioned, we use the XRF methodology for measuring the lead.
Yeah, but the point here being, we're at the later stages of life, and people are demineralizing their skeletons. That's how you get osteoporosis. And it might be the case, this is a hypothesis that I don't think I've seen anybody test, that one of the cognitive sets of cognitive problems that older people get into could be related to the release of lead from their skeletal stores. Okay, that's something that would be very interesting to look into, that maybe people, it isn't normal for people to lose it, as we say. But there may be another player at the table that we're not appreciating, in this case, lead.
I understand that. This is just like a thought I had while you were talking, but as I've heard, like when you get older, you need to increase your calcium intake so that your bones are stronger, because as you age, they become more brittle. Do you think that if you increased your calcium intake, you would like kind of minimize the shedding?
Well, that's a good question. It has, I don't understand why. It may be hormonal too. In other words, it may be multifactorial is really what I'm gonna say, is that it may be, you know, decreases in estrogen or androgen or other things, or physical activity, things that impact the strength of the skeleton. That's, I haven't seen anybody actually look into this in a serious way. This is a great project. I mean, you know, what are the factors that influence the release of calcium, for one thing, from the skeleton? But if you had a way, if you had access to an XRF machine to look at what about these other elements over time, you could do it, you know, starting at the 70s, and if you could get people to volunteer to do 80s and maybe even 90s at this point, it would be interesting to see just what this is. Now, this is going to be mitigated by other things like diet and, you know, and activity and all kinds of things. So it would be a complex study, but nonetheless, I think it's possible to do it. These are major public health issues. There's a good reason to do it, because osteoporosis and senility and other things that afflict older population, and our population is aging. We're beginning to take this more personally, you see. This is of consequence to the society and to the world, really, because this is going on all over the world. Yeah.
Bruce, what kind of water are you drinking?
Well, according to my good friend Bob Sanawani, Montgomery County water is just fine. So that's what I'm doing.
Thank you. That's promising.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for your lecture. It looks like you know much more than you tell us.
Well,
but that's wonderful.
Well, no, I can ruin any cocktail party if you want me to. Okay.
There you go.
With the clean water. Woo!
So, one more question, if I could get it in. This is a follow-up on Kent's question. Is there any way to really filter the water in your home before you drink it that would take the lead out?
Yeah, there are filters, ion exchange filters is what they're called, that can be put into, you probably can get them at you know, Home Depot, to take things like lead and other metals out of the water. It's basically a cartridge that would go into the water line that could pull out ions.
Yeah,
Again,
I think you can put the system, which I have and several other people have probably in their homes, under the sink, actually, with the water coming out of the tap. And you can get rid of all the junk, not only lead, but other metals too, arsenic and mercury and so on, if you are in a, you know, like well water, which I am on, you know.
Yeah. Now, again, though, remember, what do you do with the filter when it's done? These filters don't last forever.
Yeah.
Okay. So good question. Anyway, there are other chemicals, as we mentioned, you know, there's maybe 80, 90,000 chemicals in commercial use and about 1,000 new ones every year. We have lots of choices. Some of these chemicals are metals like lead. That's one we know about because it's been around so long. But there are other materials, endocrine disruptors, for example, and nanomaterials. How many, well, I hate to do this to you. How many of you, when you go to the grocery store, buy packaged salads and other things in these plastic bags? Well, they're not plastic. Actually, it's a high technology material called chitosan. which is made from recycled crab shells, but it's impregnated with nanosilver particles to prolong the shelf life of the material in the bag. Okay, now, is that a risk? I don't know. Neither does anybody else. The question is, though, see, these things are coming to us and we don't know. And sometimes we find these things if they're glaringly obvious, or somebody gets sick. But a lot of this stuff just goes under the radar, and we live in a chemical-rich world. I'll stop there. Otherwise, I'll ruin breakfast for you guys. Okay, I'll stop.